So welcome to the Pandemic Response Reading Series. As I've said, my name is Lauren Carter. I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm really excited about tonight's event. I started this series last spring, shortly after we went into lockdown, because I felt so much empathy for writers with books out who couldn't launch them. I had 2 books come out last year, so I think fresh off the touring circuit, I couldn't imagine not being able to do that. And so it was really important for me to open a venue for people to be able to celebrate and promote their work. I'm streaming tonight from Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation, and a place where I am very grateful to be able to call my home. I recognize that we are all streaming in from different treaty areas, and I think in my personal awareness of reconciliation, it's really important for me to express my gratitude for this land. I am also so grateful to be able to welcome these 3 fabulous writers to our stage. Candas Jane Dorsey launching her brand new The Adventures of Isabelle, and Waubgeshig Rice with Moon of the Crusted Snow, which has been out for a while and is a fabulous book. Once the event is over, I will be doing a draw. ECW has generously donated copies of both of the books for a lucky winner. So if you're here, you will be eligible for that. And if you win, you will receive an email from me letting you know the good news. Our host, Terri Favro, is another fantastic writer. She will be leading the event tonight. She is a comic book and robot-loving novelist, essayist, and graphic novel collaborator. She is the author of 3 novels, including the critically acclaimed cross-genre novel Sputnik's Children, which is fantastic, and was also longlisted for the 2020 CBC Canada Reads. Terri's pop science book, Generation Robot, A Century of Science Fiction, Fact, and Speculation, was updated and re-released just in time for the pandemic. Her new novel, The Sisters Sputnik, a sequel, I believe, to Sputnik's Children, is forthcoming from ECW in 2021. And you can find out more about Terri at terrifavro.ca. But we will also be welcoming her right here, right now. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you on the other end. Terri, if you want to come on back.
I am back. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Lauren. This is so exciting. I appreciate everybody coming here from all over the place. Personally, I am grateful to be speaking to you from Toronto, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and the land. This treaty was created to share and protect what is still their traditional territory. This area around the Great Lakes represents the dish that we all feed from, and we must share with one spoon. So it's my great privilege to introduce Waubgeshig Rice, who is an author and journalist from Waubgeshig First Nation on Georgian Bay. He has written 3 fiction titles, and his short stories and essays have been published in numerous anthologies. His most recent novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, was published in 2018 and became a national bestseller. He graduated from Ryerson University's journalism program in 2002 and spent the bulk of his journalism career at CBC. He lives in Sudbury, Ontario, with his wife and 2 sons, and you can find out more about Waub at www.waub.ca. Take it away, Waub.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Terri. And I'm very happy and honored to be here tonight. I'm joining you from Sudbury, also known as Swakamuck. It is the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng Nishnabek, and it is signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty. I just want to say big thanks to Lauren for inviting me to be a part of this tonight. This is a wonderful initiative, and I think it's great to keep the spirit of storytelling going in the midst of this global pandemic and to provide authors an opportunity to share their works virtually, because we can't get together in person. So this is really awesome. And it's a huge honor as well to be here as Candace launches her new book. It's just an honor to read alongside Candace and be a part of Terri's event and Lauren at the same time. Three writers I admire greatly. So Chimigwech, thank you very much once again for having me a part of this. I will read a brief passage from Moon of the Crusted Snow. It is the story of a world-ending blackout through the perspective of a Northern Ontario First Nation. In the immediate weeks, the community doesn't really descend into chaos as quickly as a city would in catastrophic events such as a blackout, because the people in the community are able to adapt and they have land-based skills and knowledge to survive with the loss of modern luxuries. But as the months drag on, things get a little more chaotic. And then suddenly they're visited by an unexpected person from the south who's followed by a few others. So the community has to make some tough decisions about its future, all the while figuring out how to survive in this new dark era without power and communication. So read you a passage from the second half of the book. This is chapter 22. I'll read you the first few pages of it. It finds the protagonist, Evan Whitesky, visiting the central elder figure, Aileen. And this is sort of, I chose this passage because, you know, it provides that different perspective on world-ending events because of an Indigenous history and what Indigenous people have endured, you know, being displaced and colonized on these lands. And I think it's timely because we are enduring a world-ending event at the moment. So as we, you know, look to a brighter future, hopefully brighter future in the aftermath of this pandemic, I think it's important to keep a perspective close and understand just how we can experience these events through different cultures from different lands and with different knowledge and history. Okay, so this is a bit of Moon of the Crusted Snow. Evan rummaged through the old man's closet, feeling for heavy winter jackets or at least thick wool. The dark, damp basement already reeked of mold, and as he reached deeper into the garments, the scent of mothballs danced with the must in his nostrils. He felt a coarse jacket and pulled it out into the faint daylight coming through the small window above his head. It was a formal military blazer. He recognized it from Remembrance Day ceremonies and grand entries at powwows. He remembered the old man looking proud and mighty every time he put it on. But here, in this lonely, near-empty basement, it looked stiff and rotting. Evan held it higher for a better look. The blue wool had faded and felt thin. He noticed that the buttons on the sleeves and the breast weren't actually gold as he had always thought as a child. They were brass and tarnished. He ran his calloused fingertip across the three smaller ones on the jacket's left wrist, feeling the bumps and grooves of the tiny crests. He pictured the old man holding the eagle staff proudly, wearing this military garb. The button's golden charm had seemed to accentuate the flags and feathers on the ceremonial stave. But they no longer shone. They never did, really. Evan wondered if Remembrance Day would ever happen again. The wood furnace in the middle of the room blasted heat that dissipated as it reached the unfinished concrete walls. He replaced the jacket and closed the closet door, then fed another 5 pieces of wood into the furnace. Isaiah would come later in the evening to feed the fire again for the old lady. Aileen was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping from the tea she had promised Evan. She still had an old wood cook stove in her kitchen, and she could handle keeping it stoked, but she was too frail now to load the furnace in the basement. The main floor was toasty, and it comforted Evan to know that Aileen was okay. He took off his jacket and placed it on the back of the wooden chair across from the elder. She put down her cup and smiled at him through big glasses. "Everything okay down there?" she asked. Evan looked down at the full cup in front of him, then to hers. She had wrapped her thin, wrinkled fingers around the hot glass for warmth. The sleeves of her pink sweater were fraying at the end. "Yeah, everything looks good. You got lots of wood still," he replied. "Izzy will be by tonight to top it up." "I really appreciate you boys doing this for me, Chimigwech." "It's nothing, Auntie. We're happy to help." Aileen was the last of the generation race speaking Nishnawbenwan with little English at all. She was one of only a few dozen left who could speak their language fluently. She remembered the old ways and a lot of the important ceremonies. She had more knowledge than everyone else about the traditional lives of the Nishnawbek. Anisha Jibamadzian, he asked. Minoya, I'm warm. I've lots to eat. I get a lot more company these days. That's good. We want to make sure everything's okay around here. How are you doing? He paused. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him that. His pace had been frenetic in the strange darkness of the new era. I'm good, I guess. How are the kids? Oh, they're good. They've been spending a lot of time outside. I don't think they miss school at all. He chuckled and she giggled. What about your Buzzgum? Oh, she's tired, but she's getting by. She really appreciates all the things you're teaching her about the old medicine ways, but she still gets stuck at home a lot with the kids while I'm out here doing stuff. Well, you make sure you go spend some time with her. Go for a walk in the bush. When the spring comes, ask her to show you some of the medicines. She'll know a lot now, if she remembers all the stuff from when I used to take her and all the other young girls out there. It'll be important if we don't get any new supplies in from the hospital down south. Evan thought of Nicole at home, trying to prepare herself for the skills they'd need if the power was gone for good, while struggling to keep the children occupied. He felt a twinge of guilt. She often looked tired these days. She didn't talk as much as she used to and hardly smiled anymore. No one smiled much this winter. That's a good idea, he said. Maybe I'll take the kids over to my parents' place tomorrow or the day after. Your mom will appreciate the kokum time. Yeah, for sure. He brought the hot tea to his chapped lips and sipped. The liquid seeped into the cracks and burned, but he showed no reaction. He'd learned to keep his thoughts behind a careful mask. He could not show weakness, especially now. But the old woman could still make him smile. Did you find anything down there in Eddie's closet? She asked. I found one of his old army jackets, but I didn't want to take it. The one he wore for ceremonies? Yeah, that one. Ah, yes, he loved that one. She looked out the window. Her husband had served in the Korean War and had been the last wartime military veteran in the community. He had died 4 years ago, disappointed that no young people had followed in his path. He'd been celebrated as a strong warrior and a respected elder. Evan thought about him now, wondering if he would have been able to help guide the young people through this catastrophe if he were still alive. Evan sipped the tea slowly. There was no need to fill the silence. If we can make it through this winter, Evan thought, we'll be okay. Often Aileen shared a teaching or an old story with the young men when they came to visit. Once in a while, someone would bring a group of children or teens to hear some old Nana Bush stories or her memories of the old days. There'd been no electricity in this community when she was a child, and parents sometimes brought the young ones to her to remind them that life was possible without the comforts of modern technology. Now it was critical that they learn how the old ones lived on the land. You know, when young people come over, sometimes some of them talk about the end of the world, Aileen said, breaking the silence and snapping Evan out of his wool gathering. He looked up from the plaid pattern on the vinyl tablecloth to the old woman's face. They say that this is the end of the world. The power's gone out and we've run out of gas and no one's come up from down south. They say the food is running out and that we're in danger. There's a word they say too. Apocalypse? Yes, apocalypse. What a silly word. I can tell you there's no word like that in Ojibwe. Well, I never heard a word like that from my elders anyway. Evan nodded, giving the elder his full attention. The world isn't ending, she went on. Our world isn't ending. It already ended. It ended with the Jaganash came into our original home down south on that bay and took it from us. That was our world. When the Jaganash cut down all the trees and fished all the fish and forced us out of there, that's when our world ended. They made us come all the way up here. This is not our homeland, but we had to adapt, and luckily we already knew how to hunt and live on the land. We learned to live here. She became more animated as she went on. Her small hands swayed as she emphasized the words she wanted to highlight. But then they followed us up here and started taking our children away from us. That's when our world ended again. And that wasn't the last time. We've seen what's the word again? Apocalypse. Yes, apocalypse. We've had that over and over. And we always survived. We're still here. And we'll still be here, even if the power and the radios don't come back on, and we never see any white people ever again. Evan gazed back down to the table. He felt his shoulders ease and his chest open up. He was tired, but she gave him hope. You're right, Auntie, he said. I never thought of it that way. He smiled and she smiled back, crow's feet creasing at the corners of her eyes. Well, I should probably head back out there, he said, as he tipped back the cup into his mouth. Okay then, busy day? Not really, just gotta tie up some loose ends. He didn't want to tell her the morbid details of his next task. He got up and put on his jacket and zipped it up. He took the black toque out of his right pocket and pulled it over his shaggy black hair, which nearly hung into his eyes. He said miigwech and smiled before walking out the back door. Bewitch, that's a bit of Moon of the Crusted Snow.
Thank you, Wob. That was great. I'm glad you read that particular scene because I really love that in the book, especially the line, apocalypse. We've had that over and over. I think a lot of us are kind of feeling that way right now too.
Yeah.
And now we're going to talk a lot more about the book. But first we are going to hear reading from Candas Jane Dorsey. Candace Jane Dorsey is the internationally known award-winning author of the novels Black Wine and Paradigm of Earth, short story collections Machine Sex and Other Stories, Dark Earth Dreams, Vanilla and Other Stories, and Ice and Other Stories, 4 poetry books, the mystery series The Adventures of Isabel, and What's the Matter with Jane, What's the Matter with Mary Jane, and the forthcoming The Man Who Wasn't There, the YA novel, The Story of My Life, ongoing under the name C.J. Cobb, along with several anthologies and numerous published stories, poems, reviews, and critical essays. She was editor and publisher for 14 years of the Books Collective, including River and Tesseract books. She teaches writing to adults and youth and speaks widely on science fiction and other topics. Candace was also founding president of SF Canada and has been president of the Writers Guild of Alberta. She's a community activist, an advocate, and a leader who has won 2 human rights awards and served on many community boards and committees for working for neighborhoods, heritage, social planning, and human rights advocacy. Candace, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I'd like to acknowledge I'm descendant, 3rd generation or 4th generation descendant of settlers on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional home of the Cree, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota, Sioux, and other peoples. Place where I'm actually sitting right here tonight is the traditional land of the Papas Chase Cree people. And in Edmonton, where I live, there is also the largest group of Inuit people living south of the 60th parallel. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who welcomed us to this land and weren't always, and we didn't always keep our promises, but you know, I acknowledge my role as a Treaty person in trying to honor the agreements that have been made. This is very important to me as I go through understanding more about reconciliation, in part because when I was about 20 years old, I worked as a childcare worker for teenage girls. And this was in between 1973 and 77. And basically, though, many of those girls were there as a result of the emotional fallout of the 60s. And young Aboriginal people were heavily overrepresented in care. We knew it then, just as we know it now. But just being there for those 4 years kind of radicalized me for life in terms of issues of justice, and I understood so much more than I had understood intellectually as a white middle-class person, albeit from a poor family, but certainly a poor middle-class family who accumulated books and things. And suddenly I was meeting these young women who were between the ages of 12, 13, and 18. And so, you know, they really were kids growing into young women, and the stories of their lives were so devastating, and their courage was so overwhelming. And I think that anger that root that was planted in me then has probably fueled a lot of writing over the years, and certainly has a lot to do with some of the characters that found their way into these mystery novels. First book, I first want to say that the protagonist and the city in this book are both nameless, and the city does resemble Edmonton a bit, but the protagonist never does get a name, and there are a certain number of jokes about that. And I wrote the books to write something a little lighter than what I had previously been writing, but being the writer I am, I couldn't quite get light, so here we go. A young woman who is living a street life has been murdered, and her grandmother is a friend of the nameless protagonist and asks for her help in finding out more about what happened to her granddaughter. And she's worried that the police may not take the death of a young street hooker seriously. And so they do embark on a kind of a let's poke the bushes and see what's hiding in there kind of undertaking, with, of course, huge consequences to the rules and mysteries. But so our protagonist is a downsized bisexual social worker with a smart mouth and a lot of pop culture references, and a cat whose name is now Bunnywit. Now here's where my language warning comes in, because there is definitely a language warning on this material, and it starts with the name of the cat, which used to be Fuckwit, until the protagonist realized that her cousin Thelma, who's a bit of a born-again Christian, really a lot of one, gets really, really annoyed when she has to, when his cat is referred to. So much as our protagonist is being transitioned into the private sector from social work, having been laid off a year ago, the cat is being transitioned from its original name to the name Bunnywit. So there are occasional times when the protagonist slips a little on that one. Every section of the book has a little heading that may be drawn from anything from something I saw in a newspaper somewhere years ago to a pop culture reference, or to something in the text. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the beginning of their investigation. Long-distance truck driver seeks companion on long trips, will teach to drive. We kicked around a lot of useless ideas. Finally, we decided we would fit me with some high heels, and on Sunday night, a week from when Maddie had died, I'd go out trolling with Vicky, her girlfriend. Just see what turned up. Sundays are pretty dead, she said, then, flushed with despair and her eyes filled with tears. She got up, rushed into the bedroom, but clearly only to find a distracting topic. In a moment, she was back, with the fuck me boots Maddie had been wearing in the photo Hep had. One good thing, she had big feet, she said. Try 'em. Thanks, kid, I thought, but she went on obliviously. 5-inch spikes like this, you've got to have big feet. Man, we used to envy the trannies. When you got size 11 feet, 5 inches is nothing. When you got size 5 like me, you got to stuff the toes and they still hurt like hell. Probably why I do the Susie Cream Cheese Act. You only got to wear Mary Jane's for that. That's why drag queens never complain about the shoes, I said. Hey, they fit. At the odd mix of slightly stricken and proud on Vicky's face, I leaned over to touch her shoulder. We'll find something, I said. Maddie would want to be in on it, even if it's only by the spirit sticking to her boots. That is so tacky, she said. We laughed, but we sounded like the teenage boys who can't help, to their mortification, laughing at the rape scene in a movie. 18, Little Ship of Dreams. I dreamed about Maddie Jr. that night. I woke up because Bunnywit was sitting on my head, purring. Purring for him just means, here I am, serve me. It isn't a sign of anything special. At least that's what I'd always thought. But his dishes had food and water, the litter box was clean, he wasn't in the mood to play. When I got up out of bed and sat down in the big rocker, he climbed up and sat on my head again, his heavy hips anchored on the back of the chair, his paws embracing my temples, licking the part in my hair. I dozed off there in the chair, woke with the air cooling my saliva-soaked head to hear Bun scratching in his box in the bathroom, and stumbled back to bed. He returned to my head for most of the night, and I figured the only reason I didn't dream again was that it was too damned uncomfortable. Only benefit to Bun being a Manx is that at least his tail wasn't up my nose. Warning for a change was welcome. I had to thank him, though. He'd done his best. I hoped I wasn't as competent a detective as he was a therapist. I had to wash my hair before I went out, which must have been why it rained. The bear was hungry. The bear was ravenous. The chapter headings come from Ogden Nash's wonderful poem, The Adventures of Isabelle. So, the inner city is a hungry beast feasting on the lives of children. Jailbait pickups sucked into silver Lincoln Continentals so that sexually incontinent old tourists from the burbs can spill their worthless lust into people they consider as disposable as the condoms they use to protect themselves from infection. They drive home sated and smug, believing they've outwitted the streets once again, not knowing that the street has their number. The kids have learned much more from them than they have learned in the transaction, and unable to imagine the human beings they leave behind as trash have more to say to the universe than their rich, white, and much more trashy clientele. I stood in a doorway in Maddie's boots, my feet and my spirit hurting. I was wondering already if this caper would cause permanent damage to both. Denis and Vicky had had a ball tarting me up. Denis had pulled out his drag gear and outfitted me with an astonishingly brief hipster microskirt and a gigantic set of eyelashes. All evening I felt like tent caterpillars were invading my eye sockets, but I'd managed not to counterattack yet. They'd laughed uproariously while backcombing my hair into a frightening anti-halo, and Denis convinced me that the archival stretch marks on my belly added piquancy to the view exposed by the halter top. More like poignancy, I thought, but I had to admit that until someone looked closely at my heavily made-up face, they would probably take me for a well-used 28 instead of my real age. What the devil I would do if anyone got that close, I didn't know. When they were done, even I was scared by how much I looked like the Maddie in the photograph. If the right or the wrong people saw me, I was going to press some pretty heavy-duty buttons, all right. So just skipping a section where grandmother describes some people who might have been the suspects who she'd seen hassling her granddaughter. So there she is in the doorway. Regular price, $5, $5, $5. Just as I had told Hep, every third person who passed me answered to one of the descriptions she'd given, even ruling out the minor variations. I had to assume that Hep's guys had had business on the street, were in the skin game or the drug trade, so that ruled out any guy who looked like he was shopping. What does a guy who's shopping look like? Uncomfortable, like he hopes his boss won't see him there, as if his boss being there would be just as incriminating. Cocky, like he's trying to convince the world that he usually doesn't have to pay for it. Serious, like he thinks everyone will think he has a delivery to make. Ingratiating, like he knows he doesn't have quite enough, but is prepared to throw his fake Rolex in on the deal. I had several interactions during the early evening which tested my resolve not to take this personally. I decided that the way to fend off potential tricks was to up my rates. The reaction was uniform. How much? For you? What are you on? Gee, thanks, world. You're right, I told the third one. You don't deserve to have sex that good. Eventually, you'll forget you ever met me and you'll be able to sleep nights again. He just stared at me blankly, turned to Vicky and said, what about you? Her rates were in the ballpark. When I was alone on the corner, I decided to retire to my doorway and take a break. I was leaning up against the clinker brick door frame, thinking how much a cigarette habit would enhance the image, when a confidential murmur in my ear almost made me jump out of Maddie's boots. Maddie, I missed you last week. Maddie? Didn't the guy look at the face above the packaged boobs and the fuck me boots? Guess those bottle bottom glasses weren't for show. The guy looked like a geek, but by then they all did. Ed Asner would have looked like a geek by then. He went on, I waited for you half an hour. Oh yeah, when was that? The voice didn't bother him either. That really bothered me until I saw the hearing aid. Then it made a devious kind of sense. Same time as usual. I looked at the pixel clock in the drugstore across the street. 11:32 p.m. We gotta talk, I said. We got our regular room, he said. Come on, I can't afford any extra time this week. He really did have a pocket protector lodged over his heart. I hope it worked. He explains how he met Maddie and she explains she's at Maddie, and he and asks him for any information he has. He says, I work late. I'm a software designer, games actually, and I put in long hours. My lord, he was a geek in the modern sense of the word. I met Maddie on the way home from work one night. I took a taxi for a change. It had been a terrible day, and I'd had a fight on the phone with my brother. He was hassling me about my lifestyle. He should talk. He's older than me and still lives in my parents' basement. But he's a lawyer, so he thinks that makes him a serious guy. And I design computer games, so that plus the disability makes me a nerd, right? Wrong, I said. Thanks for the vote of confidence, but I've read Bimbos of the Death Sun. So had I. I laughed aloud. He went on. It was just one of those impulses that get people in trouble. She said, want to go for a ride? Only I was the one in the car. I laughed, but all of a sudden I just said, sure, hop in. Next week, I was going home about the same time, and she recognized me. Hey, Norman, how's it hanging? She said. I hadn't heard that before. I was embarrassed. I went with her again the week after. We actually got to know each other pretty well. And on my birthday, he sniffed again, overcome. It was on the house, she said, a present for a friend, she said. Both of us had tears in our eyes. What did you know about her life, Norman? What did she tell you? Well, she lived with Vicky. They were in love. That helped her when she decided to get off the drugs because Vicky believed in Maddie, and Maddie didn't want to let Vicky down. She said it wouldn't be fair. It'd be like picking a puppy. She didn't have a pimp. Sometimes she worked in a co-op, she said, but not a pimp. That was important to her. Page turn. There was some rough stuff a few weeks ago. She had a black eye. I asked her if she wanted to just talk, but we ended up, anyway. She said it made her feel better to hang out with a decent human being. She said, men are jerks. You know that, Norman? My face isn't the only place I've got bruises. And it was true. I could see on one, breast and like her chest and side and along one leg, big black and blue marks with a funny shape, like cursor arrows. She said, cowboy boots are the pits. And I figured they were the marks when somebody kicked her. The thing is, he said, there are some things that I'm good at. I figured that anything I learned as a kid, I'm bad at. I was always hassled about everything. It was better not to try. And when I tried, the script was that I'd mess it up. When I moved out and started learning some new stuff, it was like starting fresh, and I was a lot better at it. Sex was like that. Maddie and I had fun. She relaxed and let me touch her too. She said, hookers, I heard the question mark and the difference in intonation, don't usually let that happen. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, so you see why I felt bad? I thought she'd forgotten my name. I had to wear the boots home in the subway because Vicky wasn't back from her last trick. On the platform, when I got off, the Asian woman I'd met earlier was reclining on a bench. She wasn't sleeping. She looked at me as if I'd just walked into her living room. Nehoma, I said. Big boots, she said. For a second, I thought she said big boobs, but then I noticed where she was looking. It was definitely the boots. That restored my momentarily shaken faith in her sanity. Puckle was glad to see me too. Funny, I mean. He twined around my legs, but it wasn't me. When I leaned the boots on the wall by the entry, he stayed by them, purring, and even when he heard the scrape of the spoon in the food can, he came very slowly. If his entrails were talking to me, I couldn't hear the message. He slept on the boots all night, his toes flexing rhythmically against them in his sleep. That's a little bit of setup for what's going on in the Adventures of Isabelle.
So I'm going to invite Wob to come on. as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about both books. Just a reminder that any questions that you have for Candace and Wob, put them into the Q&A section. We've already got one, and I will ask them. But first, I have a couple of questions of my own that I'd like to throw out to both of you. One of the things I found interesting about both of these books, and I'm just going to refer back really quickly to one of your characters, Candace. I'm glad you brought up Fuckwit/Moneywit, because I thought it was amazing how well developed that cat was as a character. In a book full of memorable characters, Moneywit was definitely one of the stars. Both of your books are written out of the sense of a certain community, and I would describe them as literary fiction, but they're also, I think they're genre fiction as well. Candace, The Adventures of Isabelle, to me, is very much in the tradition of the mystery suspense novel, a new take on a police procedural, edgy, but still, you know, that hard-bitten sleuth that the nameless narrator, AKA Isabelle, turns out to be. But it's also about a whole community of characters. There's a great deal of kind of drive and oomph in the book. The storytelling really keeps you going. Just to make a couple of references to other writers whose books I sort of was reminded of a little bit when I read it, was Janet Evanovich and Sparkle Hayter, which is a compliment for me at any rate. I think the storytelling was amazing. Wob, same thing for your book. It's very much literary fiction, but also a suspense horror novel. And I felt, a little bit of Stephen King in there at times. There's a sense that genre novels are really about plot and not so much about character. And I think both of your books kind of go up against that or sort of defy that. So finally, the question: how do you develop such rich characters while keeping the storytelling so compelling? Do you start with the characters or the story? What drives what? And Candace, I'll put that to you first.
Oh dear. Well, I very seldom plan at the beginning of writing something. And this book particularly, because I had two rules when I worked on it. And one was that I would just write it in order. I'd never actually written anything in order, starting at the beginning and going to the end without going back and forth or making little bits here and then fitting them in. And the other was sort of something about having fun, making writing a little fun again. I'd been working on a really serious project and I was at a really difficult time in life. And I thought, I just don't want to do that. So I kind of pulled out this little beginning. But the beginning for me was definitely the speech of the character, like the voice, the character's voice. And that just seemed to develop organically. And so I think I'm kind of lucky. When I look back at characters, I tend to know what they're like. I know what they would do and not do. And I don't have to ask myself, would they do that or not? I don't see them in front of me the way Dickens did as a separate, like, embodied being, but I know them. And I think that's fortunate, because I do know writers who have to really think their characters through from a much more basic place. I knew a writer who used to, use the Myers-Briggs personality thing to plan her to sort of understand what a character who had certain attributes would do next. Whereas I feel like they're in there, they speak. The YA book that you mentioned, it's not actually written as a pseudonym. It's as if the book is written by its character, whose name is C.S. Cobb. And
oh, okay.
And that voice just started narrating to me, and I started like writing it down. And I thought, oh crap, I'm going to have to write a YA novel, because YA and kids books are really hard. I think they're the hardest. And the younger you get, the harder they get, because you're not just writing entertainment, you're writing something that might be the first thing a kid reads, right? And so on. So when I thought, oh, here's this young adult voice speaking to me about their concerns, that I had to write down, I was like, please go away and give me some grown-ups. But it didn't happen, so that book got written. But the same with this book, like somehow this business about the show tunes that's right at the beginning of the book just set a tone of this person. And after that, I just knew what she would do. I knew. And so that's really lucky for me. And that goes back to something you said about, is genre writing plot driven? First, I got to say that I don't think any writing is truly plot driven. Even if someone comes up with a plot first, they have to have characters to carry out their plot. Somebody has to do that stuff, because otherwise the tree falls in the forest. Nobody pushed it over, right? So, and that's not a plot. That's not a story. So I think that if you don't have credible people who live in their world and who live in it in an honest and integrated way, then your story is never going to be it's never going to fully realize itself. So I think all writing is character driven from the beginning, no matter what, no matter how many things blow up, no matter how many movie things happen, it's still character driven.
But it's always fun when things blow up.
Yeah. And then the very last thing I'm going to say before I quit, my mouth up here, is also you've got to remember that genre is a marketing category, not necessarily a writing category. So if a thing has to happen in your story and that causes it to live in a genre, then it often gets chosen and marketed and sold as a genre, and suddenly you become a genre writer. But really what you are is a writer writing a story that took its elements from that. And some people love romances and mysteries and fantasy and science fiction so much that all of their storytelling goes on in those worlds.
Right.
But also some people like me, I tend to come up with a story, and then there'll be this stuff that makes it fit into one or the other of the categories. And I think that's true for more writers than we imagine. If you think of someone like Timothy Findley, and you actually sort of genreify his books, there was the mystery, there was the fantasy novel, and so on.
Yeah. The same would be true of Margaret Atwood too, I suppose, and science fiction as well. Well, I'll put the same question to you. Characters versus storytelling. Which comes first?
Characters primarily, and I would agree with Candace that writing has to be character driven. For me, I come up with the basic concept first for a story. Like with Moon of the Crusted Snow, it was always going to be a story about a Northern Ontario First Nation enduring a blackout, and which served ultimately, in my mind, as an allegory for colonialism with the arrival of settlers from the South, right? But I think to fill it out, I had to develop all the characters first. So yeah, I spent months really just mapping out these character profiles for each of the characters. And, I would even include some of the most like mundane details from a day-to-day life perspective, right? But for me, it felt like I was getting to know the characters more intimately. And in that sense, they were the ones who would help guide me through the plot that eventually came a little more clear to me throughout the writing process, I guess, right? Or the conceptualizing process, I guess I should say. But yeah, I mean, and those characters come from a variety of sources. They're inspired by real life people mostly. And in Moon of the Crusted Snow, most of those primary characters are sort of amalgams of real life people I know, like people who I admire and really look up to and really would like to try to emulate in my own life. in many ways. And, having worked as a journalist for a long time, I feel really fortunate in that I met thousands of people over the years that I interviewed who endured life from a variety of perspectives and through a variety of circumstances, right? And that really helped inform me make decisions in the character development process, but also in the writing process, and figuring out how a certain character would behave or react to a certain situation, So yeah, like for me, just to answer the question, it's about having as detailed an idea of a character as possible before I actually write out, the prose.
Right. I actually have a question that's come up on the Q&A for you, Wob, from Diana. And the question is, Wob, do you think your story of a blackout could really happen and that your story could become true if it did? Which is actually kind of an interesting question given what we're going through right now.
Yeah. Well, it was inspired by a real blackout. It was inspired by the blackout of August of 2003 that hit a lot of the eastern part of North America. I was living in Toronto at the time, but that day I just happened to be back in my home First Nation, house sitting for my dad and stepmom who were on vacation. So I was there with my brothers, and this blackout happened, and we eventually learned that it was this widespread catastrophe, right? And we got a little worried, and we started making plans about survival. We started thinking about how we were going to get food from the land around us, who we were going to partner with, and so on. And I just felt really lucky that I wasn't in the city at that time, So, and we all know how that blackout was resolved. Like within the next couple of days, everything came back online and life resumed as normal, So I had that stuck with me for many years. And, it's eventually what inspired me to write Moon of the Crusted Snow. So I think it could potentially happen again. And in a weird way, I think we're lucky that we're going through this moment right now because, we are able to experience vulnerability on a widespread scale. Many of us who live privileged and comfortable lives are understanding what it's like to sort of be on the brink. And hopefully many of us are making plans, not just for survival, but, for creating a better, society in the aftermath of this, I guess. And, that's probably not going to happen, but one can remain hopeful. But yeah, I think a widespread catastrophe could happen. And hopefully what we're going through this year will, cause us to take a step back and make those necessary plans for a better future.
Yeah, I think that maybe that sense, I remember that blackout very clearly. And blackouts, there was one huge one when I was a child in the 60s that took out most of the eastern part of the US as well, which I remember at the time being, had that sort of almost apocalyptic feel, especially given that we thought the bomb was going to drop at any minute on top of it. But what I found with your book was that there was such a sense of ominous tension that kept building up as they, the characters kept saying, well, okay, power's out, internet's down. I'm sure it's going to come back anytime now. But I kept thinking, oh, no, I don't think so. And it does absolutely keep you turning pages. Question for both of you that I'm very interested in because because I'm kind of in the same boat at the moment. I understand both of you are writing sequels, that these are series, a book, part of the first in a series, both of your books. Can you talk a little bit about any special challenges or pleasures in the book not being a one-off, but rather the beginning of a long story?
Go ahead, Candace.
Oh, okay. Mysteries suffer from this thing that's called the Jessica Fletcher syndrome. By the way, this is my my writing buddy, Joffrey. Sorry, but it keeps him quiet. Remember in Murder, She Wrote on the TV that this writer was always somewhere where people got murdered. And there's jokes about this too, like never go to quiet English villages because your likelihood of getting murdered goes way up. So you're writing a mystery series, the worst challenge is how do you bring your characters to be crime adjacent without it being completely ridiculous? So there's the police procedural and so on, and then there's sort of the hapless amateur who just we just ignore the fact that the level of murders around them is just astronomically high. So this series actually it sold as 3, and I had this conversation with Jack David, who's here in the chat.
Hi, Jack.
Which was basically, are there more than 3? Well, we don't know. So let's go with 3 and see how Nameless is doing, kind of thing, or what Nameless is doing. Nameless is too old to join the police, and I've discovered since the first book that being a private investigator is it's a method that a lot of writers use to create a credible detective, but private investigators don't actually do the stuff they do in mystery novels most of the time. So that's probably more of a challenge. I'm interested in the character and how she reacts to life, so I don't have any issues with giving her other things to react to. The real issue is it credible? My idea for the 3rd book was clever, but almost completely impossible. And in fact, I had a meeting with a bunch of police investigators and crime analysts and so on. We have this thing in Edmonton where some mystery writers will meet with some investigators and crime adjacent people. Some of them are retired, and ask questions about what would really happen if. And so I started this meeting by saying, here's the idea I had. I'm pretty sure that it would never, ever, ever be allowed to happen. Am I right? And they all said, yeah, you're totally right. So then it became almost like a brainstorming. I mean, it was brilliant. It was like 2 hours with all these really smart law enforcement people who were kind of cream of the crop. So they didn't include the bored cops, the homophobic cops, the nasty cops, the whatever. They were actually the ones who would try to clean up their cop landscape. So
they're like
were
the cops in your book. They're like
well,
the cops in your book.
The main cop, Roger's a straight up guy, pardon the pun. But they basically then we had this sort of brainstorm. Well, in the case of this crime, what would really happen then? What would be really done? How would it be investigated? What would be the failures of investigation? What would be the issues? And so they helped me keep from going off the rails in terms of reality. There's also a great conference I've got to suggest to people. It's called When Words Collide, and it's in Calgary every year in August. This year is going to be virtual in 2021, I think, but it's for genre writers. And one of the things they have is they have a policeman and also an ex-cop who then became a first responder, is now retired after like 35 or plus years as both of those things. And they actually conduct sessions on what not to do wrong. So just to give you an example from one of those sessions, you know, in the movies where they load the people into the ambulance or into the police car, and then the person who closes the door goes bang, bang on the door or on the top of the car, and then the car drives away. The cop said, never happens, will never happen. And in fact, they have a name for that in law enforcement. They call it burping the ambulance. And they say nobody ever burps the ambulance, right? So, you know, you have to find this is the kind of research you have to do.
Fascinating.
Yes, but so the problems are technical. They're not so much with the characters.
Right.
And, you know, before Wob answers, I want to have my little moment to give you a compliment, because the thing when I was reading your book, Wob, was the community spirit and the knowledge that the small community had of each other, and the kind of comfort level with each other. People didn't make big speeches, you know, they didn't have like big moments of overt drama, and yet there was this constant sense of interaction and community that I loved reading it, and I know how much small communities in general, and certainly Indigenous communities, are underestimated in terms of the kind of strength and the power of relationships in the people. So I got to say that was one of the things out of your book that I just kept me reading, because it was so beautifully realized, just the way that people would talk to each other and respect each other and treat each other. I just wanted to say that at some point tonight, that was just a wonderful thing.
Thank you very much, Candace. I really appreciate that.
So Wob, tell us how you're going to keep the story going.
Well, just quickly, just to carry on what Candace just mentioned, and I want to give a shout out to Jack here as well, and by extension, a shout out to Susan Renouf, who is my editor on Moon of the Crusted Snow. She really empowered and encouraged me to make the story, or to keep the story, as authentically Anishinaabe as possible. And those moments in the story of just those interactions or those community dynamics, those were all directly inspired by my own upbringing in my community, right? And Susan wanted to leave those parts alone and just allow the story to breathe in that natural Anishinaabe way, right? And, you know, that was just a really positive and empowering experience for me as a writer. And I'll always be thankful for Susan for you know, encouraging me to do that. Carrying on with the story, I didn't expect to be pursuing a sequel at all. And it was, I guess, due to the interest in the first book, in Moon of the Crusted Snow. So now, you know, I'm basically dreaming up the next part. And it's fun, though. It's fun to go back to these characters and go back to this world, because I did spend so much time with the characters and I have an affinity for them. And, you know, I genuinely care about them and their future. So, you know, the research that's going into it, though, is somewhat extensive, I think, because imagining a world 10 to 12 years beyond the end of this story and what's going to exist, you know, here in Northern Ontario. So it's sort of trying to figure out what will remain, you know, and that it includes like goods, infrastructure, cities and communities, and so on. So I've done a bit of research into that. But with the story itself, it's just figuring out the next part, and it'll be a bit of a migration story of sorts. They're going to venture south to see what's left of the world, but also to reclaim their original homelands on Georgian Bay. So,
well, yeah. I'm there. I want to see what happens next.
Cool.
We've hit the 1 hour mark. Not that we're going to be cut off, but I know we probably should close down pretty soon. Got a couple of interesting questions though in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask them, but I guess you'll have to answer them quickly. I don't know, too much pressure, but first of all, from my friend Beatrice, for Candace, you said that you wanted to write something that was fun and that you wrote it from the beginning to the end. Did you already have the ending, or did you find it as you went along?
Had not a single clue. Nada. Nothing. And there's a list of clues in that book at one point. That was me saying, okay, so what would be the clues? And then I made a list, and I thought, oh, I'll just slap the list in there, figure out, you know,
it was the journey. It was the journey, not the destination.
Yeah, and things would complicate, and you know, I go away for a while. I'd have a bath. I seem to have a lot of ideas lying in the bathtub. So there I was. Okay, but sometimes it would just be like, type the next thing and see what happens. And one of my other things was to try and treat it as a freelance gig, which meant not getting too precious about anything that was in it, right? And what interested me after the fact was how little I had to go back and fiddle with any small points. Like somehow my subconscious did a lot of great plotting while I was totally not paying attention.
Yeah, sometimes you need to be like that for it to sort of just happen, right? There's a final question comes from Wendy. Again, I sort of need a fairly short answer to something that I think is probably deserving of a long one. Comment on how you both write dialogue. Do you hear the conversation in your head before you start writing? Do you read the conversation for pace, rhythm, authentic voice? Wob, I'll throw that over to you first.
Yeah, I definitely hear it in my head first. And, you know, I sort of envision the people saying whatever they have to back and forth. You know, I also try to imagine their mannerisms, their facial expressions, and so on. And when you're writing about res people, which is what I mostly do, there's a certain cadence, right, to you know, res slang and so on. So that's really what I try to capture. And it's hard to look at it on the page, I find, and try to read it out again, because in the editing process, that could get changed up a little bit too, right? So yeah, after it gets, you know, sort of polished a little bit, I try to res it back up, I guess you could say. And yeah, that's part of like reading it over again and seeing if that's actually what people in my community would sound like, you know?
Right,
So
right.
that's a great question, but dialogue is just so fun to write. And, you know, I'm inspired by people like Thomas King, who I think is a master of dialogue, right? So great question.
Yeah.
Candace, you, dialogue. What do you, how does it happen for you?
Well, it happens because the characters talk like they talk. So sort of what Wob said, it's not like I hear them with my outer ear, but I hear them with my inner ear and just follow them. And sometimes I have to be careful to edit down to shorter conversations, but the reality is that in the real world, people talk more than they do in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
So you can actually have people give a little rant and still in their voice. But I thought it was interesting when you're talking about kind of how it gets altered in editing and then you res it back up. I find that some things I write, and this book is one of them, are kind of hard to read from because the people talk differently enough that I feel like I should be a better actor to read from them. Whereas I think when people are reading it the way it's meant to be, which is, you know, in print or on their readers, that they get to hear the voices way better than I can express them when I do a reading. They get to hear the different cadences, the different just the different energies that people bring to the stuff. And reading's a very imaginative, like co-creative type of activity. You know, the writer and the reader are really working together a lot of the time, and that's different in the movies where it's all given to you, or TV. But you know, both books and radio give you just a lot of room for the imagination, and so I just try to put it down the way I think they would, and then I hope that the reader hears it the way I meant it, and that's the perfect interaction. Like sometimes I almost don't like to do readings. It's like, go away and read the book and we'll talk later, you know?
Well, I see our fearless leader, Lauren, has come back on, so I think that's our signal.
Yeah,
the fun may be over.
I've been enraptured listening. Really inspiring. I'm trying to do NaNoWriMo for the very first time this month during a pandemic. Good idea, eh? So it's been really great to hear you guys talk about your work. And I loved what you said, Candace, about not being precious, because I think that's so important. And having fun too. Really appreciate that idea of adventuring. So, and terrific questions, Terri.
Terrific books. Great books to be able to ask questions of.
Yeah. And I popped the links into the chat for purchasing, and an email will go out tomorrow too for people to do some Christmas shopping. But yeah, I want to just thank you thank you guys for being here and coming on. Yeah, really appreciate it. I always find this ending part so awkward because I really would like everybody just to have a glass of wine and, you know.
I'll go up and pour myself one, and you can all go away and get your. We can all come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is kind of, you know, you start conversations and you wish you could kind of just keep going on, but this isn't quite the right medium. But it's been marvelous. So thank you for inviting me and for teaming us up together, because it was wonderful to hang out with you and meet everybody and meet you. And I think we do have, even though our books are very different, they have a lot in common.
Oh yeah, I agree. This was super fun. I just loved being with you all tonight. So Chmigwech, thank you again very much.
That's what you say in my part of the world.
Nice. Well, thank you all. Yeah, and I'll do the draw once I get the list of everyone who came. You can expect, so those of you who are still here, you can expect if you won, you'll get an email. Regardless, you'll get an email with the links to purchase the books tomorrow. And I really appreciate all of you coming out this evening. I know there are tons of events going on, so thank you for choosing this one. The next one, just to give a little bit of a shout out, will be January. Ian Williams is going to read. He's a good friend of mine, so we'll be reading together. He asked me if I would read with him, which is a big honor, and I'm very thankful for that. And Charlene Deal from the Winnipeg Writers Festival will be hosting that, so it'll be a good event. So stay tuned for news about that.
Thanks.
You all.
Thanks.
Have a very, very lovely evening and a good weekend. It's almost here.
Hey, everybody.
Stay safe.
Bye.